It started as a simple request from my husband, one that I thought would remain an unspoken fantasy, an idea we might flirt with but never actually follow through. He had always been adventurous, teasing me with suggestions that left me blushing but never pushing too hard. Yet this time, his words lingered longer than usual, and I could see in his eyes that this wasn't just a passing thought. It was something he truly wanted. "Do you trust me?" he asked one evening, his voice soft but filled with a weight that made my heart skip. I hesitated, unsure of what was coming. Of course I trusted him. Our relationship had always been built on mutual respect and open communication. But I could sense something different in the air that night, a kind of anticipation that set my nerves on edge. "I want to try something new," he continued, his hand gently brushing mine as we sat on the couch, the dim light from the fireplace casting soft shadows around us. His touch was familiar, comforting, and yet, the intensity in his gaze made me feel vulnerable, exposed. "I want to invite two strangers to share something with us." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly. Two strangers? I blinked, my breath catching in my throat as the implications of what he was suggesting started to sink in. "What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper, my heart racing. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he confessed, his thumb tracing slow circles on the back of my hand. "I want us to experience something, together. Something different, but only if you're comfortable with it." A swirl of emotions rushed through me: fear, curiosity, excitement. This wasn't something I had ever imagined. The idea of sharing such an intimate moment with strangers felt wrong, and yet, the way he spoke, the way his hand tightened slightly around mine, made me wonder. Could I really do this? Could we? He leaned closer, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "You're the most important part of this, you know that. If you don't want it, we won't do it." His words were meant to reassure me, and yet they only heightened the tension in the room. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand what exactly he had in mind, but part of me was too afraid of the answers. Instead, I found myself nodding slowly, my body responding before my mind had caught up. "I trust you," I whispered back, my voice shaky but resolute, and I did. Despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me, I trusted him. We had always navigated our relationship with honesty and respect, and I knew he wouldn't push me into something I couldn't handle. But that didn't stop the knot of nerves from tightening in my stomach as the days passed and the plan became more real. The night arrived far sooner than I had anticipated. I spent the day pacing, second-guessing my decision. Part of me wanted to back out, to tell him I couldn't go through with it. But then I'd see the excitement in his eyes, the way he spoke about it with such passion, and I'd remember why I had agreed in the first place. This was something we were doing together, something new and unknown. And maybe, just maybe, it would bring us closer. As the clock ticked closer to the arranged time, I dressed carefully, choosing something that made me feel confident, strong. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down the fabric of my dress, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't sure what to expect, how I would feel when the moment finally came. But I knew there was no turning back now. When the doorbell rang, my heart leapt into my throat. He glanced at me, his expression a mix of excitement and nervousness, and I could see that he was just as anxious as I was. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his hand resting on the small of my back. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I truly was. The two strangers who entered our home were nothing like I had imagined. They were kind, respectful, with an ease about them that helped to calm some of my nerves. They smiled warmly, introducing themselves, and for a while it felt more like we were hosting guests for dinner than anything else. We talked, shared stories, laughed, anything to keep the inevitable at bay. But beneath the surface, the tension simmered, unspoken yet palpable in every glance, every subtle shift in the room. I felt my husband's hand on mine, squeezing gently, grounding me in the moment. I looked at him, searching his face for reassurance, and found it in the soft smile that played on his lips. We were in this together. "Shall we?" one of the strangers asked, their voice soft but full of intent. My stomach flipped, and I felt my pulse quicken. My husband's hand remained steady on mine, and I nodded, even though my mind was racing with uncertainty. We moved to the bedroom, the air thick with anticipation. My husband's touch felt different now, more deliberate, more charged with the knowledge of what was about to happen. As the strangers moved closer, I felt the world around me blur slightly, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "Remember," my husband whispered in my ear, his breath warm against my skin, This is about us." And with those words, the night truly began. As the night unfolded, the atmosphere shifted from casual conversation to something far more intimate. The dim lighting cast shadows on the walls, and the air felt charged with an intensity I hadn't anticipated. I found myself acutely aware of every movement, every breath, every brush of skin against fabric. The two strangers moved gracefully around the room, their presence both alluring and slightly intimidating. My husband stayed close, his hand never leaving mine, offering silent reassurance. I felt my body tense as one of the strangers approached me, their touch gentle but deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as their fingers grazed my arm, tracing a line from my wrist to my shoulder. I could feel the warmth of their skin against mine, and despite the flurry of nerves swirling inside me, there was something undeniably electric about the moment. My husband's gaze never left mine. His eyes were soft, filled with the kind of admiration that made my heart ache. He wanted to see me experience something new, something that would challenge the boundaries we had built together. And somehow, amidst the confusion and anticipation, I understood that this wasn't just about physical desire. It was about trust, about pushing the limits of what we could share. The other stranger stood behind him, their hands resting lightly on his shoulders. I could see the way he reacted to their touch, the subtle way his breath hitched as they leaned closer. For a moment, I felt a pang of jealousy, a twist of something dark and uncertain in the pit of my stomach. But just as quickly, it faded, replaced by a sense of connection, of being part of something bigger than myself. One of the strangers turned their attention to me, their hand resting on the small of my back as they leaned in, their lips brushing against my neck. The sensation was soft, almost teasing, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the feeling, to let go of the doubts and fears that threatened to consume me. "It's okay," my husband's voice whispered in my ear. "Just feel." And so I did. I let myself surrender to the moment, to the unfamiliar touch of strangers and the steady presence of my husband by my side. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream, a mix of sensation and emotion that was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the evening wore on, the touches became more intimate, more deliberate. My heart raced as hands explored, as lips found skin, as the line between strangers and lovers blurred. I could feel the tension building inside me, a slow burn of desire that grew with every stolen glance, every shared breath. My husband's eyes never left mine, even as the strangers moved between us, their hands roaming over our bodies with a practiced ease. It was as if he wanted to ensure I was still with him, that this was still something we were experiencing together. And in those moments when our eyes locked, I felt more connected to him than I ever had before. The room was filled with soft sighs and whispered words, the tension between us all mounting with every passing second. My husband's touch grew bolder, his hands exploring me in ways that felt both familiar and new. I could feel his desire, his need, and it mirrored my own. There was something intoxicating about sharing this experience, about opening ourselves up to something so different, so forbidden. But with every touch, every glance, I could also feel the weight of what we were doing. This wasn't just a game. It was real, messy and complicated and fraught with emotions I hadn't expected. I could sense the internal conflict in my husband's eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as they brushed against my skin. He wanted this, yes, but there was also a part of him that was struggling, just as I was, with the implications of what we were doing. And then, just as I thought I might drown in the intensity of it all, one of the strangers leaned in, their lips brushing mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, filled with a hunger that took me by surprise. I felt my body respond, a rush of heat spreading through me as I leaned into the kiss, my hands finding their way to their shoulders, pulling them closer. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my husband watching, his expression unreadable. But there was no anger, no jealousy, only desire. He wanted this for me, for us. And in that moment, I let go of the last bit of doubt that had been holding me back. This was happening, and I was ready. The room seemed to close in around us as the intensity of the moment grew. The strangers moved between us, their hands and lips exploring, their touches sending shivers down my spine. I could feel my husband's gaze on me, his eyes dark with desire as he watched me lose myself in the experience. At some point, I felt his hands on my waist, pulling me toward him. His lips found mine in a kiss that was both familiar and desperate, filled with all the emotion he had been holding back. I kissed him back, my heart pounding in my chest as the heat between us intensified. The strangers watched, their hands still roaming, but in that moment it was just him and me. We had crossed a line that we could never uncross. But instead of fear or regret, all I felt was a deep sense of connection, of understanding. This was about us, about pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. And as the night wore on, I realized that we were stronger for it. The intimacy between us was overwhelming, the emotions raw and unfiltered, and when it was over, when we finally lay tangled together in the quiet aftermath, I felt both exhilarated and utterly exposed. My husband's arms wrapped around me, his breath warm against my neck as we lay in the stillness, the weight of what we had just experienced settling over us. But there was no regret, no shame. Only a quiet understanding that we had shared something profound, something that would change us forever. The quiet after the storm was almost palpable. We lay there, tangled together, the soft rise and fall of our breaths the only sound in the room. The two strangers, still beside us, had become a part of this intimate web, but in the moments that followed, it was my husband's touch that kept me grounded. His arm was draped across my waist, fingers tracing light circles on my skin as if he was silently reassuring me that everything was still all right. And somehow, despite the surrealness of the evening, I believed him. I could feel the warmth of his body pressed against mine, his chest rising and falling in time with my own. The silence between us was heavy, not with regret, but with the weight of what we had just done. A boundary had been crossed, a new chapter opened, and there was no going back. And yet, in that moment, I didn't want to go back. The strangers were kind, respectful, moving with a grace and understanding that made the night feel less daunting. They exchanged glances, quietly gathering their things, and offered soft goodbyes. I watched them go, still dazed by the whirlwind of emotions, my body tingling from the intensity of it all. The moment the door clicked shut, it felt as though the air in the room shifted, leaving just the two of us in its wake. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply lay there, the weight of the night pressing down on us in a way I hadn't anticipated. I wondered what he was thinking, if he was as lost in the haze of emotions as I was. But I didn't have the courage to ask, not yet. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was low, tentative, as if he wasn't sure how I would respond. "Are you okay?" he asked, his hand still resting gently on my hip, fingers tracing idle patterns that soothed the tension building in my chest. I took a breath, turning my face toward his. Our eyes met, and in his gaze, I saw the same uncertainty reflected back at me. But beneath it was something else, something deeper: love, trust, connection. "I think so," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Are you?" He smiled, a soft, almost relieved smile, and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." We lay in silence again for a moment, letting the enormity of what had happened settle between us. I could feel the warmth of his skin, the familiar rhythm of his breathing, and despite everything, it felt comforting. Safe. I didn't know if I could go through with it, I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. I wasn't sure how I'd feel once it started. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at me. His fingers brushed a stray lock of hair away from my face, his touch gentle and reassuring. I wasn't sure either, he confessed, his brow furrowed slightly. But I wanted us to experience it together, to push those boundaries and see where we could go. I nodded, biting my lip as I tried to put my swirling emotions into words. It was intense, I said, my voice trembling. But it wasn't bad, it was just different, strange. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "I never wanted to make you uncomfortable. If you felt that way at any point, I wish you would have told me." "I wasn't uncomfortable," I replied quickly, shaking my head. "At least not in the way you think. It was just a lot to take in. I wasn't sure how to feel about seeing you with someone else." His expression softened, and he nodded. "I understand. It was strange for me too, seeing you with them. But at the same time, I think it made me realize how much I love you." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "I love you, too," I whispered, my heart swelling with emotion. "But where do we go from here? What does this mean for us?" He paused, his thumb stroking my cheek as he considered his response. "I think it means we're stronger than we thought," he said finally. "That we can explore these new parts of ourselves together without losing what we have." His words made sense, but they didn't completely erase the uncertainty I felt. "Do you think we crossed a line we can't come back from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He thought for a moment before answering. Maybe he admitted. "But that doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing. I think this is something we'll need to process together, talk about, and figure out where we stand. But I don't regret it. Do you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the question hang in the air as I reflected on everything that had happened. There were moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if we had made a mistake. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me, the way his touch had felt so grounding, so familiar amidst the chaos, and I realized that I didn't regret it either. "No," I said softly, turning to face him fully. "I don't regret it." He smiled again, and I felt the tension in my chest ease just a little. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." As we lay there in the aftermath of the night, the room now quiet and still, I knew that he was right. We had crossed a line, but it didn't have to break us. If anything, it had shown us the strength of our bond, the depth of our connection. And as we held each other in the quiet darkness, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. But even as the warmth of his embrace lulled me into a sense of calm, I couldn't shake the lingering questions that hovered at the edges of my mind. What if this changed things between us? What if it opened doors that we weren't prepared to walk through? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside for now, choosing to focus on the here and now, on the love we shared and the trust we had built. For now, that was enough. As we lay in the dim glow of the bedroom, the weight of the night hung between us like a heavy mist, thick with unspoken words. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet intimacy, but there was still a pulse of something unresolved, an undercurrent of doubt and confusion that neither of us wanted to acknowledge just yet. My husband's fingers traced slow, languid circles on my back, and for a moment I closed my eyes, trying to lose myself in the familiar sensation. His touch had always been my anchor, the thing that kept me grounded when everything else seemed uncertain. But now, after everything that had transpired, I couldn't help but wonder if even this, our connection, our bond, had been altered in some fundamental way. "I keep thinking about it," I whispered into the darkness, not entirely sure if I was ready to voice my thoughts. But the quiet between us had grown too heavy, and I couldn't stand the silence anymore. His hand stilled on my back, his breath catching slightly. Thinking about what he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. "About them. About what happened." "I don't know how to feel about it," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Part of me feels like we crossed a line, like things can't go back to the way they were. But another part of me." I trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. His hand resumed its gentle motion, and he let out a slow, thoughtful sigh. "I've been thinking about it too," he said after a long pause. "I thought I'd feel different after, maybe even guilty, but I don't feel bad about what we did. It felt right in some strange way." I shifted in his arms, turning to look at him, searching his face for any sign of regret or doubt. But his expression was soft, his eyes filled with the same warmth and affection that had always been there. "Does that scare you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He met my gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. "A little," he admitted. "But I think what scares me more is the idea that it might change things between us. I don't want to lose what we have." I nodded, my heart aching with the weight of his words. "Neither do I." For a while, we simply held each other, the silence stretching on as we both grappled with our thoughts. But despite the uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of peace between us, a quiet understanding that, no matter what happened next, we were in this together. As the night wore on, we eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, our bodies still tangled together, the warmth of his embrace the only thing keeping the lingering doubts at bay. The days that followed were a strange mix of normalcy and tension. On the surface, everything seemed the same. We went about our routines: work, dinner, casual conversations, but there was an unspoken undercurrent that neither of us could ignore. The memory of that night lingered between us, a shadow that seemed to follow us wherever we went. It wasn't that we regretted what had happened, at least I didn't think we did. But there was something unresolved, something that felt like it was hanging in the air, waiting to be addressed. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way his eyes lingered a little too long when he thought I wasn't paying attention. and I felt it in the way I couldn't stop thinking about that night, replaying the moments over and over again in my mind, trying to make sense of how it had changed us. One evening, about a week after that fateful night, we were sitting on the couch, the TV on in the background, though neither of us was paying attention. I could feel the tension building between us, the silence growing too heavy once again. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "We need to talk about it," I blurted out, my heart racing as the words left my mouth. He glanced at me, his expression guarded, but he didn't argue. "Yeah," he said softly, "I guess we do." I turned to face him fully, pulling my legs up onto the couch and tucking them beneath me. "I don't know how to feel about it," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I mean, it was intense. It was. Exciting in a way I didn't expect. But I can't shake the feeling that it changed something between us. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he considered my words. "I've been feeling the same way," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "It was more than I thought it would be. I knew it would be different, but I didn't realize how much it would affect us afterward." I bit my lip, struggling to find the right words. "Do you regret it?" He was silent for a moment, and I could see the conflict in his eyes as he searched for an answer. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it, but I do wonder what it means for us now." The weight of his words hung between us, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you think it's something we should have done, or was it a mistake?" He reached out, taking my hand in his thumb brushing gently across my knuckles. "I don't think it was a mistake," he said slowly. "But I think we need to figure out what it means for us. I don't want this to come between us. I don't want to lose you." I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a blanket. "I don't want to lose you either," I whispered. We sat in silence for a while, our hands still clasped together, as we both tried to make sense of the complicated emotions swirling inside us. There were no easy answers, no clear path forward. But one thing was certain: we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. All we could do now was figure out where we stood and what came next. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke again. "Do you think we should talk to someone, like a therapist or something?" The suggestion took me by surprise, and I stared at him for a moment, trying to process the idea. "Do you think we need that?" I asked, my voice cautious. He shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. I just think maybe it would help to talk to someone who could help us figure this out. I don't want this to be something that festers between us, you know." I nodded, understanding where he was coming from. "Yeah, maybe you're right." We didn't make any immediate decisions that night, but the conversation felt like a step forward, a way of acknowledging the weight of what had happened and agreeing to face it together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The days passed, and though the heaviness of that night still lingered between us, it felt less overwhelming than before. The air wasn't as thick with unspoken tension, and we'd started talking more about what it all meant, about what we wanted going forward. Still, there were moments when I found myself questioning everything. The trust, the love, the connection we had built over the years, had it all changed irreparably? Or was this just another phase of growth for us, a challenge to overcome together? One evening, after an especially quiet dinner, I decided to confront the thoughts that had been plaguing me. "Do you think we made a mistake?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. It was a question I had avoided asking for fear of the answer, but I couldn't keep it in any longer. He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to respond. "I don't think it was a mistake," he said carefully. "But I do think it's something we didn't fully understand going into it. I don't regret it, but I wonder if we were prepared for what it would do to us." I nodded, understanding what he meant. "I feel the same way. It wasn't what I expected, and I'm still trying to figure out how to process it all. But I don't regret it either, not entirely." He squeezed my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in that familiar way that always brought me comfort. "That's okay," he said gently. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We just need to keep talking, to keep being honest with each other." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest at his words. It was true, we didn't need all the answers right now. We just needed to keep communicating, to stay connected as we navigated this new territory together. As the days turned into weeks, we continued to talk, slowly peeling back the layers of our emotions and desires. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of what we had done seemed too much to bear. but there were also moments of clarity, times when I felt closer to him than ever before, as though the experience had deepened our bond in ways I hadn't anticipated. But then, there were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of that night. I found myself thinking about the strangers, their touch, their presence, the way they had made me feel things I hadn't expected. It was confusing, exhilarating, terrifying. And though I had no desire to repeat the experience, I couldn't help but wonder what it had unlocked inside me. One evening, as we sat on the couch, the TV playing softly in the background, my husband turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked, his voice low, as though he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear the answer. I blinked, surprised by the question, but I didn't hesitate in my response. Sometimes, I admitted. Not in the way you might think, though. It's more. Wondering what it all meant, what it meant for us, for me. It's hard to explain. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I think about them too, but mostly I think about us, about what it did to us, how it changed things. I bit my lip, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I wasn't sure how it had changed things between us. In some ways it had brought us closer, forced us to communicate in ways we hadn't before. But there was also a distance between us now, a space that hadn't existed before that night. And I wasn't sure if we would ever be able to bridge it. "Do you think we'll ever go back to how we were before?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly with the weight of the question. He was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know," he said finally. "But maybe that's not the point. Maybe we're not supposed to go back to how we were. Maybe this is just a new chapter for us, a chance to grow and evolve together." I nodded, though his words didn't fully ease the knot of uncertainty in my chest. I wanted to believe that we could come through this stronger, that we could find a way to move forward together. But part of me feared that something fundamental had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. As the weeks turned into months, we continued to navigate this new reality, slowly finding our way back to each other in small, tentative steps. We talked more openly than we ever had before, shared our fears, our doubts, our hopes for the future. And though the memory of that night still lingered, it no longer felt like a weight we couldn't bear. One evening, as we lay in bed, his arm draped over my waist, I realized that we had come through the storm. We were different now, changed by the experience, but we were still us, still the same couple who had built a life together, still the same people who loved each other fiercely despite the challenges we had faced. And maybe that was enough. "Do you regret it?" I asked him one last time, my voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. He was silent for a moment before answering, his voice soft but steady. "No, I don't regret it. But I'm glad we talked about it. I'm glad we faced it together." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me for the first time in months. "Me too." And with that, we closed our eyes, the weight of the past finally lifting as we allowed ourselves to move forward together.